knowledge, it is a goal always ahead, never quite reached, but it is a much more than that. The self is the God within, the closest psychological approximation to the Godhead, capable of provoking the wonder and awe we usually associate with encounters with divinity. We already alluded to this numinous quality of the collective unconscious in Chapter 4 during our discussion of the inferior function. Finally, the self is also the transcendent function, which establishes wholeness and order within the psyche. The self clothes itself in many personalized forms, stretching all the way from animal to human to godlike. But it can also pick impersonal forms: a lake, a mountain, a rose, a tree. It may even appear in abstract geometric forms called mandalas, which we will discuss later in this chapter. Clearly, the self as both the source of the individuation process and its ultimate goal is beyond rigid definition. Let's begin by discussing its numinous aspect as the God within. The God within us, the integration of the anima animus, leads us by a natural route back to something that is strange to us and yet so near, wholly ourselves and yet unknowable, a virtual center of so mysterious a constitution that it can claim anything: kinship with beasts and gods, with crystals and with stars, without moving us to wonder, without even exciting our disapprobation. This something claims all that and more, and having nothing in our hands that could fairly be opposed to these claims, it is surely wiser to listen to this voice. I have called this center the self. It might equally well be called the God within us. Jung was neither asserting nor denying the existence of a literal God. He was describing a psychological reality, not a metaphysical reality. He was merely presenting something he had encountered time after time in his work with his patients, in his own life, and in his studies of mythology. At a certain depth in the psyche, numinous forces are awakened, which we experience as godlike. Jung felt it was wrong to deny psychological experience just because it didn't fit conveniently into a belief system. His openness to unusual phenomena never faltered throughout his life. You will recall from Chapter 1 that while in college, Jung was amazed at the resistance of his classmates, who refused to even consider the possibility that paranormal events could occur, though they dismissed each other's such events with contempt. To Jung, the uneasiness seemed at odds with their alleged surety. Jung believed that if ordinary people experienced phenomena like ghosts, for example, then ghosts must correspond to something significant in the psyche, regardless of the physical existence or non-existence of ghosts. Similarly, Jung could not accept Freud's insistence that at all costs he must preserve psychoanalysis against the black mud of occultism. For Jung, all human experience was worthy of description, and any model of reality worthy of the same had to include all human experience, not merely those experiences which fit a particular theory. Because he presented the self as a psychological reality which paralleled the concept of God, Jung was criticized by the religious as well as by the materialists. The religious accused Jung of trying to reduce God to a psychological function, while the materialists accused him of trying to substitute metaphysics for science. It is hard to walk the razor's edge between those two camps, but Jung was willing to attempt no less. Though he always firmly denied that his model had any metaphysical reality, he did argue that if a God existed, the only way God could be experienced would be through some such psychological function as the self. In other words, if we don't already have within ourselves some experience which corresponds to divinity, we couldn't apprehend divinity at all. Regardless of whether or not a literal God exists, the fact that we innately possess an archetype of the numinous indicates that it self invariably feels that numinous quality that we rightly associate with divinity. One can no more communicate the experience of the self to someone who has never had such an experience than one can describe the experience of love to someone who has never been in love. The self is not limited to by our expectations of morality. Our concerns are not necessarily its concerns. This amoral, inhuman aspect of the self is far too frequently overlooked by people who talk blithely about finding the higher self or their guardian angel. Real encounters with the self can be terrifying and incomprehensible. This was an issue that occupied Jung throughout his life. He dealt with it most fully in a very late essay. Answer to Job. Jung examined Job's behavior towards God and God's behavior towards Job, and found Job came out the winner. God was presented as a petulant and irrational tyrant, while Job was both loyal and thoughtful. Jung felt that the story of Job marked a turning point in consciousness when God was forced to acknowledge Job as his moral superior. God was for the first time forced to consider the possibility of a true relationship with mankind, which would eventually lead to the appearance of Jesus, who combined God and man in a single being. As might be expected, this was a highly controversial stance which won Jung many enemies. Jung was never able to get his critics to understand that he was talking about a psychological reality, not a metaphysical reality. To Jung, the Bible was a record of the evolution of humanity's conception of the divine. When he talked of the God of the Bible, Jung meant the self, the God within. Job represented the state of conscious development of humanity at a unique point in time. From that point on, conscious and unconscious were forced to find a point of rapprochement. This struggle still goes on within our individual psyches and is reflected in our dreams. Each of us reaches a point in life when it is no longer enough to live life unconsciously. In our attempts to become conscious, we are forced on a long journey that inevitably brings us, like Job, to confrontation with the self. There, we are forced to acknowledge its inhuman aspect, which is presented in the story of Job when God tells Job that he created the Leviathan and the behemoth. That moment of awakening is always a heroic struggle, and few possess the courage of Job when exposed to the terrifying energy of the self. Job reveals that the proper response to such inhuman power: bow your head and acknowledge the superior strength, but don't give up your values. Jung has a similar image in an important dream. Kneel, bow your head, but don't quite let your forehead touch the ground. The experience of the God within can take many different forms, from a literal belief that one has encountered Jesus or Buddha, to the equally religious fervor characteristics of social reformers or even scientists. Jung often pointed out that the zeal of materialist scientists to discover the ultimate secrets of the universe is essentially an unacknowledged religious belief. An example would be the subatomic physicists of today, who are convinced that they are about to put together a comprehensive grand unification theory which will explain everything in the universe once and for all. Obviously, there is no such final explanation. Science is based on the provisional nature of all its theories. After all, scientific laws are only models that proved effective in describing and predicting natural behavior. Eventually, all scientific laws are either overturned or subsumed within more encompassing models. It is wise to be aware of the psychological reality of the self, and that an archetype is at work. The absolute surety of our inner experience may have little or nothing to do with its outer truth. This is a concept that fundamentalists of all faiths should keep in mind more often. Mandalas, although wholeness seems at first sight to be nothing but an abstract idea, like anima or animus, it is nevertheless empirical insofar as it is anticipated by the psyche in the form of spontaneous or autonomous symbols. These are the quaternity of mandala symbols. isn't a circle. Just as we could trace the progression of a square becoming more and more like a circle as the number of its sides doubled, it is possible to follow the progression of consciousness towards the self by observing the evolution of such symbols of wholeness in dreams. This may sound incredible. However, Jung in fact did trace such progression of dreams, not once but twice. More recently, art therapy Rhoda Kellogg discovered that the drawings of preschool children progress from initial scribbles to crosses, then to crosses with circles, which is a basic mandala form. Their first attempt to draw the full human figure almost invariably are not the stick figures we might expect, but circles. It is important to understand that wholeness means in this what wholeness means in the psyche. Most of us are accustomed to linear goals. We seek perfection, not wholeness or completeness. If we get a score of 80% on a paper, we try to get an 85 the next time, then 90, 95, then 100. When we reach 100 and can go no higher, we set a new goal. Our moral goals are essentially the same: deny the dark and seek the light, climb ever higher towards perfection, etc. But as we found in studying the shadow, light isn't enough. A well-rounded personality needs the darkness as well. Otherwise, one will never attain that median degree of modesty which is essential for the maintenance of a balanced state. It is not a question, as one might think, of relaxing morality itself, but of making a moral effort in a different direction. A moral effort in a different direction, a strange concept for those of us raised on American varieties, where morality is supposedly simple and straightforward and directed by an inner guide or conscience. Unfortunately, that supposed conscience is nothing more than an internalization of parents and all other voices of authority we have heard throughout our lives. The voice of the self is something quite different. It has an authority that transcends those personal parental voices, and its counsel is not for perfection, but for wholeness. So next time we will read the transcendent function. This was the first part of chapter 7, titled The Self.